2014, during his last news conference as the Prime Minister, a somewhat crestfallen Dr. Manmohan Singh said, and I quote, "I honestly believe that history will be kinder to me than the contemporary media, or for that matter, the opposition parties in Parliament." Unquote. A little over 10 years hence, and soon after his death, history already seems to be kinder to Dr. Singh, offering a broad overview of how India's economy has evolved over the last 34 years after Dr. Singh's first extraordinarily reformist budget in 1991 is Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, an eminent economist who himself has been at the heart of the country's economic planning since the late 1970s, in a career spanning some 5 decades, during which he has held highly consequential positions in India's economic establishment, as well as at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Dr. Ahluwalia has had a first-hand experience in the country's transformation from the commanding heights economy to a free market one. Dr. Ahluwalia spoke to MCR from New Delhi about what he thinks of Dr. Manmohan Singh's legacy and beyond. Welcome to Mayank Chhaya Reports, Dr. Ahluwalia. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
I was in the press gallery of India's parliament when, during his first budget speech in 1991, Dr. Manmohan Singh said that no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. 34 years later, where do you think that idea of India has reached?
Well, I think it's clearly made progress. I mean, look, when he said that, we were still a low-income country. And I mean, the whole focus was, can we get out of this and start a process of development? I mean, we haven't done anything like the kind of transformation that China has brought about. But compared to many other developing countries, progress in India, by most of the metrics, has been actually not bad at all. And I think today people are willing to believe that India will be one of the larger, more important economies over the next 10, 15 years or so. I don't think that Dr. Singh's notion of an idea, was that India would become some kind of a dominant power, but that India would be a power to be taken seriously. I think that's happened.
Since 1979, when you returned from the World Bank, you have been at the heart of India's economic planning for more than 3.5 decades. What was the view in the 1980s when you were Special Secretary to Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi? What was the conversation about the country's economy at that point?
Well, I was Special Secretary to Mr. Rajiv Gandhi the second half of the 80s. I mean, for the first half, I was just economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance. And, I think when I came in, it was very clear to me, and I've said this in my book, Backstage, which is it covers that area in my thinking at the time, that I had felt even when I came back that we were not performing the way we should. I mean, basically, if you look back over the history of India since independence, I mean, in the first maybe 10 years or more, right up to 1960, India's economic growth fell slightly short of what was targeted. I mean, those days, the target of 5% was quite common. And we were actually achieving something like a little over 4, depending on which time period you use. But the point is, there weren't too many other countries doing that well either. Everybody else was also doing poorly. And it was hugely better than the performance before independence. So, that's normally what you would use is, are you doing better than you were doing before independence? Clearly we were. And are you doing better than other countries? And I think we clearly were. But I think somewhere from the early 60s onwards, and certainly through the 1970s, India's economic performance deteriorated. And those of us who were looking at it from the outside were more aware of it than the ones inside. So I was quite clear when I came back that, look, this is underperformance and we need to be doing a lot better. Then the question is, what do you need to do in order to do better? And my feeling was that the economy is over controlled. The old planning kind of philosophy had got converted into the wrong belief that by government imposing a lot of controls on resource allocation, you lead to an improved outcome. We didn't. And I think we needed to change that. Rajiv Gandhi was actually aware of the fact that our policies were, if you like, out of sync. Because, he became the prime minister immediately after his mother was assassinated, Mrs. Gandhi, in November of 1984. And there was a brief period, he went to a general election. He became an elected prime minister at the beginning of 1985. And shortly after that is when I moved to his office and we got into a sort of, it takes a little bit of time before you can get used to a new boss. But then we started the interaction. And it was very clear to me that he was aware that we need to make big changes. When he came in, he said we got a plan for the 21st century. In Parliament in February, he said, look, how can we compete if we are working with systems that are 20 years out of date? Now, this was the first time ever that the Prime Minister of India had said that the system we're working with is wrong. This was never said by Panditji, it was never said by Indira Gandhi. People were willing to accept that something is going wrong, but nobody had said the system itself is wrong. But, having said that, and I think he started making some changes, but I think he ran out of steam, partly perhaps not having put together a team that actually believed in his views. Such team that he had put together disintegrated very early, which may be bad luck. It could be a little bit of bad political management. He was overtaken by other events, the Bofors scandal,
Right.
for example. But, when you look back on it, I don't think that he was at the heart of it at all, but it did happen. And then politics took over. After the first 2 years, he was not in a position to push anything very much. In the meantime, we ran into problems on export performance, current account deficit slowly building up. Many people felt that his effort to, if you like, increase defense capability led to increased expenditures that would have contributed to the balance of payments crisis. And as you said, in 1990, the country ran into a very, very severe balance of payments crisis. During that period, we'd been working on what needed to happen. His principal secretary was B.G. Deshmukh.
Right.
I was the special secretary below the principal secretary. And BG had said to me that, look, we managed to do some things, but we're not really delivering on what the prime minister wanted, which is to bring about a system change. And why is that? And I said to him that that's because we're not taking a comprehensive look at the reforms that we need. It's all being done in silos. Each ministry is looking at what it can do, whereas the whole problem is that no ministry is really in charge of everything that's needed to improve its own performance. You need a comprehensive look. Now, technically, the Planning Commission should have done that. They didn't. And BG said, why don't you write a paper? And, if Rajiv comes back, we'll give it to him. So I started writing this paper. Of course, he was tragically assassinated, so that put an end to those kinds of thoughts. And when the new government came in, what you had was a government that ultimately was run by VP Singh. VP Singh then ran into his own problems because, didn't have a strong support. It was a minority government, and the balance of payments crisis was getting more and more difficult. And separately, he brought in reservations for the OBCs, which created more domestic instability. And then you had the Iraq oil price hike,
Right.
when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and the Americans went in, and things were highly uncertain. India didn't look like in good shape. I mean, we were hit by high oil prices. We had a pre-existing balance of payments deficit. We were losing money even before then. And then, given the instability of the government and the uncertainty about oil prices, it was bound to get worse. And it did get worse. Nothing could be done during that period because you had a government that didn't have a long lease of life. It was replaced by another government supported by the Congress party from the
Right.
outside, which was obviously a temporary arrangement. And reserves, we kept losing reserves. So I think that was the crisis when the government at the time was run by Chandrasekhar with the support of the Congress from the outside. And obviously, the Congress was not going to support a government that had to do a lot of tough things because then they would get blamed for whatever was done. And so basically, that was the end of that government, and we had a new election. As a result of that election, the Congress came back as leader of a leader of a coalition. Narasimha Rao became prime minister, and he was advised that you've got a big short-term crisis that has to be managed. You need a very, very credible person. And one of the two names recommended was Manmohan Singh, who in the end became prime minister.
Right.
So, at that point, I mean, to my mind, it was a bit of a no-brainer what we have to do. And you have to remember that at that time, it was also the time, 1.5 years or so after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed yet, but most of East Europe had gone. So, I mean, it didn't take much thinking that we need to change, and we did. And Dr. Manmohan Singh laid out what needs to be done. It was not very different from the paper that I was working on, which had also got leaked during VP Singh's time and came to be known as the M document.
Right.
Dr. Singh was, of course, aware of that paper. And when the budget came, I mean, he just did a whole lot of difficult things that needed to be done. Bring the fiscal deficit down, devalue the rupee in two steps, eliminate import licenses over a large range of items, not over consumer goods, but capital goods and intermediates, and get rid of industrial licensing controls in a big way, give more freedom to foreign investment and so on. It still wasn't what I would call big bang. We still had controls on foreign investment, but up to 50% it became automatic in a certain range of items. So it was a typical little bit of, it was by Indian standards a huge change.
Right.
But you wouldn't say there was a wholesale adoption of free market economics, which many of our critics accused us of.
Right.
But one way or the other, the thing worked and the crisis was over within 2 years. We managed to get assistance from the IMF and the World Bank. We were doing things which most of these guys approved of, and I would say confidence returned. Now, if the only job to be done was to control the crisis, we could have given up by 1993 because the crisis was over. But I think this is the difference, that Manmohan Singh was aware that this is only a start. We have a huge agenda of structural reforms to do, and we continued doing it. Now, when you look back, you can ask yourself, did we do enough? Almost certainly we didn't. My own view, and I expressed that in my book Backstage, that, we were compelled to do things gradually. We could not, and we didn't even want to do a big bang reform of the kind that had become very popular by American economists advising Russia what to do,
Right.
which would turn out to be a disaster anyway. So, we made changes, but we made them slowly. And if you ask me, I have said that, look, it was right to do it slowly, but we did it too slow. So what we did in the next 15 years, we should have done in the next 7. That's something we were not able to do. So I don't say that, in that sense, it wasn't a perfect program reform. And many people also say that, the reforms would have been more effective if we had done certain things first. Certainly, for example, education. If we could have fixed education a lot of what we did would have been much more effective. But it takes 15 to 20 years to fix education. I mean, the idea was there, but fixing education means dealing with institutions, dealing with state governments who control primary education, etc., etc., etc. So that's for economists to work out. I mean, I would not say that we had an ideal sequencing of reforms, but we did have a very clear understanding that it's going to be gradualist, and I think it's a success of the system that although we were functioning in a democracy with governments changing, coalition governments, etc., we managed to get a sufficient consensus that succeeding governments didn't actually undo any of the reforms. I mean, the Narasimha Rao government was succeeded by the United Front government, which continued pretty much in the same direction, although it had as a member of the coalition the Communist Party of
Right.
India, not the Communist Party Marxist, but the Communist Party of India. That was followed then by the Vajpayee government, which of course was a BJP dominated, but still a coalition. And the BJP did not have a problem with certain aspects of the reform, but they did have earlier a problem with opening up more foreign trade, more foreign investment, etc. I mean, there were segments in the BJP that viewed this opening up as just the start of another East India Company experience.
Right.
But they managed to continue. I mean, they saw that the time had come to change. How they managed the change has to be left to them. But I would say there was continuity. And then the UPA government came in when Mrs. Gandhi was the political leader, but she appointed Dr. Manmohan Singh as prime minister. So he had a 10-year, 2 terms of 5 years each as prime minister of a new coalition government. And I think broadly, the policies continued in the same direction, though some of the liberalization on foreign trade slowed down because the Communist Party of India, Marxist, was a member of the coalition, and you had to adjust to the fact that it takes a long time for people to change their minds.
Right. There's a great deal to unpack here, but would you say that right until 1991, although Dr. Singh was very much part of the economic system as RBI governor, etc., he was still a peripheral figure in a manner of speaking in terms of the making political impact of what he wanted to do. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, because before that he was being governor of the Reserve Bank doesn't enable you to
Right.
make reform the whole range. I mean, it enables you to do the right thing in areas where the Reserve Bank is important. And there, I think he did, in a critical area, preserve the independence of the Reserve Bank. At a certain point, I think there was very strong pressure that the Bank of Commerce and Credit International,
Right.
the Dubai-based bank owned by a Pakistani banker, and they were operating on a sort of representative basis, and they wanted to have a banking license. Dr. Singh did not think that the bank quite deserved the license because he had doubts. I mean, he had a very good sense of what markets think. So he collected a lot of information. So, as governor of the Reserve Bank, he was, I think, responding to what he was hearing in the market, not any actual factual documentary evidence.
Right.
And he just felt that there were doubts. At that time, the finance ministry had this question that why should the Reserve Bank of India have the right to decide which bank is to be given a permission? And they moved a proposal to change the law, to shift that right from the RBI to the finance ministry. And of course, they said we consult the RBI. So if you look at it that way, it just looks like a little bit of changing the furniture. But Dr. Singh took the view that, look, this is reducing the credibility of the Reserve Bank. And he made it plain that if that change was made, then he would resign. And Mrs. Gandhi found his continuation to be sufficiently important that she negated that decision to shift the power from the Reserve Bank of India to the Finance Ministry. So that was a case of,
Right.
within the limited context of where you can operate, he was doing his bit.
Right. Would you say that he was a natural free marketer at heart as an economist of such caliber?
Who, Manmohan?
Dr. Singh, yes.
No, Manmohan is too uh, broad thinking and wide ranging a guy to try to characterize as a free marketer. I mean, he knew better than most the values of the market. He also knew better than most the likely failures of non market. And he always knew that you got to do a bit of both. So he was not an ideological person. I mean, even when he's pushing for markets, he was doing it in the context of, yes, you can always have an argument for more regulation, but on a balance of consideration, this sort of regulation is bad, this sort of market pressure is good.
Can
And I
one,
mean, let me take it, if you take that view, there's no question that we were doing far too much regulation. So, the need to move India from one extreme of regulating, I mean, we were more regulated than the social, not more, but almost as regulated as many of the socialist economies.
right?
So it was a no-brainer that, if you want to be somewhere in the middle, then India must liberalize, and that's what he did.
Can one argue that had it not been for the absolutely desperate foreign exchange reserves crisis, the reforms may not have been pushed that strongly during the Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao's government?
Well, and I think I'm very sympathetic to the idea. Crises are always a great opportunity because it's in a crisis that you can actually do something. But this depends in the sense that if you have a government that's been going on for a while and it faces a crisis, then it's able to do a few things to counter the crisis. It's not able to get up and say, oh, by the way, everything we've been doing is wrong and let's change the whole lot. When you have a situation where you have a new government come in, it's easy to blame the previous lot for having mismanaged things for a couple of years, and then you make bigger changes. And where you're making more basic changes, which he was, and I mean, the Congress Party political guys were very aware that, we're really walking back on what we used to say. Well, he managed to persuade them that, look, we've always modified our policies in the light of changing circumstances. So there is continuity, but there's also change. So what is this continuity? You could say, well, we've always wanted growth. That's what we want now. We wanted growth that is just. That's what we want now. I mean, the previous system wasn't generating growth. It would have been a different matter if it was generating a lot of growth, but not a just growth.
Right.
It was not generating growth. It was not reducing poverty and not doing anything on inclusiveness. So it was easy to get up there and say, look, we've got to do something dramatically different. And the agenda that was laid out was very large. I mean, industrial policy, trade policy, exchange rate policy, financial systems, attitudes to foreign direct investment, attitudes to technology, and attitudes to reserving things for the public sector. Now, that's a pretty big agenda. And, while we didn't get it all done and we took too long, I think quite a bit of it got accomplished over the next 10 years or so. But having said that, when you do that, you basically take yourself out of the low income category into the bottom of the middle income category. And then new challenges arise. The economy becomes more complex. You need different institutions. If you're going to let the private sector a much bigger reign, you need to know how you're going to deal with competition. You put in competition commissions. You approach things in a different way, and you almost have to set up new institutions to deal with these things, which is, again, a very complex task. And in a way, that's still happening. I mean, we haven't finished by any means.
Right. How do you see the fact that Prime Minister Rao stood by so solidly in terms of its political backing to what Dr. Singh was trying to achieve? Was that something that's not been fully assessed in my judgment? The way because I had had a couple of conversations with Mr. Rao around that time, and he basically said that I had told Dr. Singh that you look after the economic side, leave the politics to me. That was basically his message. Do you think that's
Well,
been?
that is exactly, I think that's correct. In fact, what Dr. Singh told me
Hmm,
was only a slight variation on what you said, because he said, "Look, you've been chosen because you know what to do on the economy." But I would go a little further than that. I think Narasimha Rao knew that the policy we had inherited wasn't working, so he knew that changes had to be made. In fact, when he first got elected, he called a bunch of us. This is before he would have had any briefing from Dr. Manmohan Singh. And he said, we've got to get the cobwebs out of our mind. So we've
right.
got to think anew. He knew that. He knew it had to be different. I think he also knew that he didn't have the technical competence to design the reform. And that's where he needed a technocrat. And Manmohan was the ideal technocrat. So, somewhere in my book, I mentioned that people always ask me, how do you distribute the credit for the reforms between Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh? Well, it's very clear that without the backing of the Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh would not have been able to do anything. And Manmohan Singh fully accepted that, no problem at all. I think it's probably also clear that Narasimha Rao didn't see himself as wanting to educate people on the reforms. He would rather let Manmohan do that.
Right.
So as long as he's providing the backing. I mean, his view was he was a cautious man, and I think his view to Manmohan was that, look, Manmohan, you do what you have to do, and if it fails, you'll get the blame. But if it succeeds, we'll share the credit. And I think that's
Right.
fair.
Right.
We should therefore get some. It's a little bit like somewhere I think I said that, it's a little bit like people ask, who built the Taj Mahal, and you say Shah Jahan. Uh, that doesn't mean that Shah Jahan was the architect. I mean,
Right.
to build the Taj Mahal is a complex technical thing. I think Narasimha Rao would be quite happy to be called the Shah Jahan of the reforms structure, and Manmohan Singh as the architect.
I
I
think
mean,
that's
they're both
apt.
very major things, because you can have a structure, but you get it wrong, the damn thing will collapse.
Absolutely. At that time, I used to hear some criticisms about how two men in particular, Dr. Singh and you, with their World Bank backgrounds, were really bringing in things that India was not ready for. How sensitive or how aware were you of those criticisms?
No, it was a bit unfair on Dr. Manmohan Singh, because he was completely untainted by the World Bank background. I mean, his exposure as an employee of the UN was in UNDP,
Right.
which was more a kind of developing country view on development.
People
I'm the
didn't
one
care
who was
about that,
saying,
right?
hmm?
They didn't care about that little detail.
Yeah, I mean, that's, if you want to insult someone, you insult them. What the hell?
Right.
There. Look, many people told me you're just following the World Bank script. That's an important issue. I mean, were we just following the World Bank script? The answer is no. Um, we had our own script that was discussed at length internally. I mean, the paper I mentioned, which I authored, which came to be called the M document, because it was released during VP Singh's time. He asked the cabinet secretary to have it discussed. It didn't have an author identified, although it came from the PM's office, and I was the senior most economist there. So everybody said, we know it's written by Montek Ahluwalia, but he doesn't admit that. So let's call it the M document. That's what one of the journalists, that's why it came to be called the M document, right? Now, I think the thing is that it's a it laid out something which was internally consistent and went much beyond what the World Bank would normally have plugged for. I mean, for example, clearly a first devaluation, yes, they would have insisted. Uh, Improving the fiscal deficit, of course, they would have insisted. But I think what we did in terms of the extent of delicensing, they loved it. But I don't think they even dreamt of pushing that through, because they never thought India would do that. So, and by the way, it's not as if the World Bank invented these things. I mean, the theory on what is distortive about trade was actually invented before the World Bank got into the act. Because after all, I mean, Jagdish Bhagwati,
Right.
well-known trade economist, and his late wife Padma Desai wrote the kind of classic book on Indian planning and how it's mucking things up by interfering with trade. And that was way back in the early 60s or something like that, right? There were other people internationally who had raised these issues. We were aware of all that. We were also aware of the fact that the World Bank was pushing a similar line. The idea that you, as long as the World Bank is saying something which is broadly in line with the current consensus, it's impossible for any reformer to be not following something similar unless the reformer is doing something completely out of the consensus.
Right.
So I think we had our own, and by the way, in certain areas, we clearly didn't agree with the World Bank or the IMF. One of those is freeing up capital controls. It was a highly contentious issue. And I think Jagdish Bhagwati had written a very famous, the difference between trade in widgets and trade in capital. That it's a good idea to free up trade, but it's not a good idea to free up capital flows. That's exactly what we did. And that was not, in those days, the World Bank IMF line. The World Bank generally was in favor of freeing up capital controls as much as possible.
Right.
So I think we had a job educating our own public, and we weren't just doing it what the World Bank said. But I think deep down people also understood that. But when you're in public life, I mean, if you're going to be criticized, you use whatever insult you can think of.
Right.
Yeah.
To come to the period when Dr. Singh rose to be Prime Minister, 2004, the first term between 2004 and 2009. By 2004, the reforms had been in place for a little over a decade in effective term. And India's GDP grew at that point, I think, 8% per annum. How much of that do you think can be attributed? Of course, it can be attributed to the reforms, but how much of that can be attributed to what happened in 1991?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. The growth rate of any economy in any period has got to be a function of the inherent strength of the economy, okay? A function of the state of the external economy, that matters. And then, of course, the policy changes you make during that period. Now, the inherent strength of the economy obviously reflects policy changes made earlier. So the fact that the 91 reforms liberalized a lot of things, opened up a lot of things, affected the manner in which investment took place. And so the economy we had at the start of 2004 was affected by the 91 reforms. I mean, if we had not had the 91 reforms, we would not have done nearly as well. It's also, I think, the global economy is important. And that was a period when globally everybody was doing well. So that added a bit. I think in terms of domestic policy, critics, and there are many, have said that the UPA didn't do anything in terms of policy. It just sort of benefited. Some people say, therefore, you just benefited from the reforms that happened earlier. Others feel, oh, you just lucked out. I think that's not entirely fair. Because first of all, the high growth that we observed between 2004 and 2009 or 10, that was really the result of a creation of confidence in the private sector, that we are pro-private investment, and especially pro-private investment in infrastructure. I mean, it was clear that infrastructure was a lagging area, and the signal given was, look, we want more private investment in infrastructure. This led to this great big boom in investment in that period. I mean, it was later, by the way, criticized that, too much lending during a boom to various fellows in the private sector. That's virtually impossible to control. All upswings lead to some excess investments, and then the downswing takes care of that.
Right.
So we had a big upswing hit by the global financial crisis in 2008. We managed that quite well because we had a very aggressive fiscal stimulus to counter that. But the strategy we had originally outlined was the fiscal stimulus is only for 1 year and we should then phase it down. I think the finance minister failed to phase it down. So that was clearly a failing. I mean, it should have come down starting in 2010. I mean, it started in 2008 towards the end, the Lehman Brothers crisis, and also the terrorist attack in Mumbai, which would have affected people. But, so we countered that. Most of 2009, you needed that stimulus. In 2010, that stimulus should have been withdrawn. That was not done. And I think that's a mistake. The government then ran into the problem caused by what is called the temper tantrum, when the US sort of started signaling that they may be going to raise interest rates and so on. That led to a big withdrawal of funds. So we were also hit. So we had a bit of turbulence at that point. But it's very important to note that India survived that turbulence without having to go to the IMF.
Right.
I mean, we were on the mend within 2 years, in spite of having had an interruption in growth. The growth rate had begun to pick up in the last year of the UPA government. I think on the political side, one of the things that happened at that time was a series of allegations of scams connected with the allocation of spectrum or the allocation of coal mines or whatever. And I think that was poorly handled, in the sense that the Prime Minister's position was always very clear that, look, if there is a problem, let's discuss it in Parliament and let's see what a considered view would be, and then let's take corrective action. And furthermore, when you found a problem, let the law take its course. Whereas the attitude of the opposition was, for example, the CAG report had claimed that, there's been this huge loss of revenue. Now, there are very serious doubts about the technical quality of that report. And we know later on that the first draft of that report did not assert such a large loss. Right. It was the CAG himself who revised it to a huge loss. Nothing wrong with that. That's his right. But we must remember that the CAG report is never meant to be a final pronouncement. It's not like a Supreme Court judgment. It's a document that goes before the committee of the House that deals with CAG reports. This committee then questions the CAG. He has to defend whatever he said. And it's the report of that parliamentary committee that constitutes, if you like, the document on the basis of which policy is made. Well, the opposition stopped Parliament from functioning because they said, we don't want to discuss this report. You should set up a joint parliamentary committee. Okay? Right. The whole year was wasted. When the CBR thought that they had found something wrong in what the minister did, Mr. A. Raja from the DMK, and they charged him, Dr. Manmohan Singh ensured that he resigned. Of course, the DMK appointed another minister, but that was their, if you like, sharing of cabinet seats. But the interesting thing is that if you look back, after 5 years of court cases, the CBI court comprehensively rejected the charges and said that nothing has been proved and there's nothing remotely resembling proof of corruption. Now, that's not to say, by the way, whether the allocation should have been done administratively or should have been auctioned.
Right.
That's a separate issue. The scam was not that you followed one method rather than the other, because countries are varied in that. The scam was simply that the method you followed was either intended to or led to massive corruption.
Exactly.
After 5 years of examination, no such corruption was found. But even in retrospect, nobody is willing to admit that they overdid the criticism.
Indeed,
No,
indeed.
I think that had to be politically managed, and they failed to manage it.
Yeah, that's where I think his weakness as a sort of non-politician came in. He was not a natural politician by any yardstick. I'm not even sure if he really enjoyed being prime minister in his second term. He seemed to give the impression that he had essentially switched off in very significant ways. Although, if you look at the accomplishments overall, I was just looking at it: right to information, the
Yeah.
National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005, right to free and compulsory education for children between 6 and 14, and of course, Aadhaar, not to mention the seminal 2008 Indo US nuclear deal. So these are quite remarkable accomplishments, but they normally don't get talked about much.
Well, I mean, we did talk about them, and I've talked about them in my book, but you're
Right,
right. I mean, you can write a book on it, but the question is at that time,
right,
how do people react? And
right.
I think that was not managed well.
Yeah.
I think
You had,
part of the problem was an unwillingness on the part of, let's say, the Congress Party as the dominant party to stand behind its colleagues from another party. I
right,
mean, when there was the slightest suggestion of something improper being done by a Congress minister, he was promptly removed because that's a party decision.
right,
But to remove someone from another party cannot be a purely party decision because the other party would say, look, if he's not charged by the CBI, why are you assuming? Once he was charged by the CBI, of course, he was removed. But I think there was a great hunger, a sort of a Madame Defarge like desire to get the guillotine working on whoever was charged with corruption. And
right,
I think we need these things happen. I think we had no experience of such charges being thrown around. Now, since then, around the world, you've seen these charges.
right,
I mean, there are huge charges of corruption in other developing countries also.
right,
And people have maybe got a bit more used to the fact
right.
that these are problems that have to be handled in a particular way.
Yeah. In the context of the nuclear deal, you have spoken about how Dr. Singh had turned to President APJ Abdul Kalam to tide over the severe opposition that it was facing, especially from someone like Mulayam Singh Yadav, and even within the Congress party. Talk a bit about that.
Well, I mean, look, I think on the nuclear deal was India has historically always valued its sort of so-called non-alignment and so on. And the nuclear deal looked as if we were sidling up a bit too much towards the Americans. But the truth of the matter is that Dr. Manmohan Singh was quite convinced that the non-proliferation treaty, to which Russia was also a signatory, was unfair because they isolated 5 countries as having a right to have nuclear weapons and others were not. And I think the Indian view our view has always been consistent that, look, we are in favor of unilateral disarmament. So if all countries agree to give up nuclear weapons, we applaud that. We will ensure that we don't do it. But if 5 countries insist on having nuclear weapons, then we reserve the right to develop ours. And after all, we're in a difficult part of the world. Our neighbor to the north was a declared nuclear weapons power, and Pakistan was reported to become a clandestine one, but we knew that everybody knew that they were developing it, right? So the idea of having a nuclear weapon, and this was developed during Narasimha Rao's time, explosion took place during Vajpayee's time, and of course the Americans actually came down on us like a ton of bricks, all sorts of sanctions, etc. And I think Vajpayee did a very good job in restoring relations with America kind of back to where they were before the nuclear deal. But that only meant that the additional sanctions have been removed, but we still had the full weight of non-proliferation burdens because we couldn't actually get technology or even uranium fuel as long as those burdens remained.
Right.
I think it's an interesting question that, I've written in my book that I think it was Condi Rice who persuaded George Bush that it's
Right.
not in America's interest to do this, and we should discuss with the Indians. Dr. Manmohan Singh immediately saw that this was an opening, and he gave the go-ahead that we should pursue this matter. Domestically, there was a lot of concern, including from our own atomic energy department, that is this just that the Americans are pushing their way in order to sell us a lot of nuclear reactors, which will prevent us from building our own reactors. And I mean, that was not the case because there was no compulsion on us to purchase American reactors. I was one of the team that actually was in a meeting with George Bush before the Prime Minister's visit, in which Bush was very clear. I mean, he said, look, I'm not doing this deal because I want you to buy American reactors. I'd be happy if you do. But I'm doing this deal because I cannot easily expand nuclear energy because I've got lots of opposition within the country. And if you're going to save the world, it's good for India to expand nuclear energy. So you can get your reactors from wherever you like.
I see.
And he went out of his way to say that that is so. But of course, yeah. So I mean, but Dr. Singh was very clear that the only people who know about nuclear energy in India are the guys in the atomic energy department. I mean, the rest really haven't got a clue.
Yeah.
So he made sure that the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, the Department of Atomic Energy, Anil Kakotkar, very distinguished nuclear physicist, he was part of his team when he came to America to sign up on the nuclear deal. And at the very last minute, when they were discussing the final version, which had been approved by the two official sides, including by Condi Rice on the American side and by Natwar Singh on our side, Kakotkar raised certain points that certain phrasings in the nuclear deal could create problems for India.
I see.
And Dr. Manmohan Singh said, look, if Kakotkar is not in favor, it's not going to happen. So he effectively, quite publicly, gave Anil Kakotkar the effective veto. And we told the Americans that the Prime Minister, this was at 8 p.m. on a particular day, and the meeting with the President was the next day at 10 o'clock. So Dr. Singh told our guys, please tell the Americans that we can sign our statement, but the paras on the nuclear deal will have to be dropped. Now, you can always put in things like, we had useful discussions and we haven't reached any agreement. But basically, we would not have an agreement. And that would have been disastrous. Well, at the last minute, when this information was conveyed to the Americans, they were a bit shocked. And they informed Condi Rice. And in fact, their team had gone home because they thought it was all done, right?
Right.
Condi called up Natwar Singh in the middle of the night or early morning, saying, I must see the Prime Minister once to just give it another chance. So, I mean, people were not very sure what's the point of a last-minute intervention, but Prime Minister agreed to meet her. And she said, let's get our team together to just see what your problems are and see whether we can adjust. So Shyam Saran, who was our foreign secretary at the time, and Nick Burns on the American side were told to go away to another room and see whether problems could be resolved. And for this purpose, the Prime Minister asked Kakotkar, look, what changes do you want? And be precise on those, because I don't want a situation where you say something in general and then these guys come back saying we've taken care of it, and then you say, no, it's not good enough. So Kakotkar was asked to specify what changes he wanted. Now, this required the Americans to accept those changes. And this required us to persuade them that, look, this doesn't jeopardize U.S. interests. Now, the problem is in the U.S., there were a bunch of non-proliferation ayatollahs. I mean, they inventing reasons, always suspecting that India might, misuse any flexibility given and all the rest of it. That's normal negotiating.
Right.
But I think Condi must have told Nick Burns that, look, if the Indians want more slack, And if it doesn't compromise our essential interests, give them some slack. And
see.
the the word went back to Bush and the PM as they were discussing that the differences have been resolved. So they were able to say, and we've reached an agreement on the nuclear deal.
Right.
They were not able to circulate the document because that was still being typed. So, the press was told, well, it's coming, but let's talk about it. This is what's happening, blah, blah, blah. So
Okay.
it's very exciting. And, it's interesting. Many people think that, look, what's the big deal? I mean, so we didn't sign it then. Maybe we would have signed it 4 months later, 3 months later. But it was a very complicated arrangement where several things had to be done. American laws altered, American amendments to their own act made. The International Energy Agency had to make some changes, and the nuclear suppliers group had to accept that India will be given a special carve-out.
Right.
Now, that required a lot of diplomacy, but the fact is, without the American help, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, even vis-a-vis the Chinese president, Bush had to call the Chinese president and say, look, we want this, it is good, and get it done. Now, think to yourself, this happened in the last maybe 2 weeks of the Bush administration. Everything was completed.
Right.
Had we missed that, it would have gone into the Obama administration. Now, remember, the Democrats were much more pro-nuclear and anti-proliferation than the Republicans were. And Senator Obama had actually voted against the 123 amendment that was necessary when it came to the Senate.
Right.
So, is it reasonable to believe that had it missed the Bush thing,
it may not have happened? Yeah.
It may not have happened at all.
Yeah.
I think in my book, I say we have to give credit to Condi Rice for picking up the phone at the last minute.
Exactly.
And she said this in her autobiography.
Right, she did.
She was really depressed, but she felt that if the Indians want to be in a nuclear ghetto, then who am I to stop them? But then in the middle of the night, she woke up and said, no, I must have one more go. So it's a very interesting case. I think that decision to have one more go made a huge difference in getting the deal done. Now, most people in India do not realize that the benefits of the deal was not whether we get an American reactor or not. The benefits of the deal was the removal of certain restraints which earlier prevented many other forms of cooperation. A lot of the defense-related cooperation that has taken place in the present regime in India with the US
flows from that, yes,
would not have happened if the nuclear deal had not happened. So these are continuations. Something you do now makes it possible to do something later, etc., etc.
Right.
And I think that on the Indian side, that was masterminded, personal responsibility taken by Dr. Manmohan Singh. And in the end, as you pointed out, the left decided to leave the government on this.
Right.
And he called their bluff. He advised Mrs. Gandhi that, look, we will look ridiculous. He said, let's call their bluff. And he then managed to get APJ Kalam, former president, to get Mulayam Singh on board.
Right.
Relations between Mulayam Singh and the Congress party were not all that great. But APJ Kalam persuaded Mulayam Singh, and Mulayam Singh came on board, and the left, leaving the Congress, leaving the UPA, did not cause the government to collapse.
Yes.
So it was a great achievement.
It is. Just last couple of things, Dr. Ahluwalia. One is not related to what we are talking about. I want your view on why it is that we still don't have the full convertibility of the rupee. I've been hearing about it for the last 30 odd years. What is the obstacle here?
But first thing, let's be clear. The most successful developing country in the world is China.
Right.
We don't have convertibility of the renminbi. So the notion that the convertibility of the rupee is a sign of strength is a fundamental mistake.
Okay.
Convertibility of the rupee is only possible if you also believe in full freedom of capital movement. I don't think today, this used to be the view of the Americans. It used to be during when Larry Summers and all were Treasury Secretary. It used to be the view of the IMF also. But in the last several years, that has not been the view of the IMF. They've recognized that in a world of freely floating currencies with large movements of capital, which can be driven by any number of expectational things, you really cannot assume that the international capital flows reflect well considered market judgments. And
Right.
therefore, nowadays the view is you should manage capital flows. That doesn't mean ban them, but do it with certain amounts of regulation. That's what we're doing. As long as we're doing that, we can't have convertibility of the rupee.
In that context, somewhat related is the this current debate over de-dollarization and the way U.S. has bristled at the possibility. What is your view on that?
Well, the US, of course, and the current administration of the US expresses itself with great joy and exuberance on almost everything. So I just want to step back a little. The proposition that the BRICS countries want to de-dollarize is actually false. I don't think there's ever been a report or a document or a communique that says we should do that. What I think has happened is that once the United States decides to sanction Russia, for example, on oil sales, I don't think any country is willing to take the line that just because the US doesn't want you to buy oil from Russia, you shouldn't buy oil. Okay. The problem is that buying oil from Russia is not possible if you have to go through the established channels, because the banks will not, in fact, agree to that. So you have to invent a way of accepting rupee payments, or whichever country. So many countries are looking at ways, and this is an inevitable consequence of, if you like, weaponizing
Right.
the dollar. But I think, I'm not sure about this and we should check, but I think our foreign minister has said that there are no plans to, as it were, dethrone the dollar, although that is bound to happen over time, and it is happening, but at a very gradual rate.
Right.
The proportion of international reserves being held in dollars is slowly declining. The proportion of transactions denominated in dollars is not declining that much, but that too is likely over time to decline.
Right.
And that's a natural process. I don't think we should, neither we nor the US should worry about it. So I think this BRICS, the assertion that the BRICS have agreed to do something here is false. And I don't think the BRICS would do it, and it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Anyway.
To conclude, how do you look at President Trump's threat to levy major tariffs on India? He described India as one of the biggest abusers of tariff regime.
Well, he said we're a tariff king. It feels good to be a tariff king, though I can see the implicit threat in what he's saying. No, look, frankly, I think I don't know enough about US politics, so I don't want to complicate life for those of our government that have to deal with the US. But I think it's early days of the Trump administration. And I frequently hear American commentators saying that President Trump likes kind of making very bold and extreme statements, and maybe it's part of a strategy of making you feel a little nervous because God knows what he's going to do, etc., etc. That's fine. I think we just have to wait and see what he actually does.
Okay.
Clearly, if he imposes tariffs on India, it'll be bad. Whether we can negotiate, discuss with him, persuade him that it's not called for, etc., that only our negotiators can tell. I hope he doesn't. It's not just us. I mean, I think the decision to impose the assertion that you're going to have tariffs from February 1 on Mexico and Canada, that's also a bit of a disruption. Because, after all, the United States has entered into sort of formal treaty agreements with these countries. So what you're doing is you're unilaterally changing them with no obvious reason why you should.
Right.
I can see that the United States has a problem with China. But the earlier view expressed by Jake Sullivan was that, look, we have a security concern. So in certain small areas, it won't be free trade. But what he had said was a small yard with a high fence. But that yard seems to be becoming bigger and bigger. And it's not easy to determine what the yard will be. I mean, after all, you can say, I'm not going to import X and Y from China. But what are you going to do about importing the same thing from ASEAN if most of that stuff is coming from China? So are you going to impose tariffs on ASEAN because they have some Chinese components? It'll become very difficult to manage this. So we need to see in practical terms, what are the Americans going to do? And I just hope that over time, some of this will settle down.